Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it is time for another super special video. So, we have been working our way through Rivals of Ixalan, talking about the best cards for various formats, and it's time for Standard, and I'm super excited because we have a very special guest today, one of my favorite brewers in all of Magic. We're joined by Zac Elsik. How's it going today, Zac?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so before we jump into it, how are you feeling about Rivals of Ixalan in general? Like, you play a lot of Standard, you brew a lot of decks. Is this a good set, a bad set, mediocre set? Where does this kind of fall as far as sets are concerned overall?
Initially, it looks really cool, mostly because there are a lot of big dinosaurs that I'm excited to play with, the Elder dinosaurs. And there's a lot of really sweet rares and mythics with unique effects like the legendary enchantments that transform. So I'm very excited to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I'm excited for it too. There's a lot of really cool stuff, and we kind of narrowed it down to 10 cards along with a couple of honorable mentions. We don't have any real specific order, so we're going to do honorable mentions first and then just kind of go by color. So the last card we talk about isn't necessarily the best card. These are just kind of 10 cards that we think will be good in Standard. So anyway, let's jump into our list, starting with the honorable mentions. And the first card we have is super unique. A blue instant by the name of Release to the Wind. So, Zac, what are you planning on exiling in Standard with Release to the Wind?
So this is one that I put as an honorable mention because I don't see exactly a good home for it yet. It makes sense that you could target your own stuff that has an ETB, an Enter the Battlefield effect, like Rogue Refiner or Cast Out, and just get that effect again for free, in a sense. I think one of the cooler applications to it is targeting your Planeswalker mid-combat. If they go all out and attack your Planeswalker, you can just exile it and then cast it again on your turn and reset the loyalty. That's unique. And so I'm excited for this card because I think it might have a home if the right cards get printed or if the right shell gets found, because it's a unique effect.
Yeah, it is certainly super unique, and I hadn't really thought about the Planeswalker aspect, but that's a really good point, using it to save your own stuff. And it obviously works well, sort of like a more common blink or flicker effect, like a momentary blink or something, if you want to reset a hostage taker or something like that. There's some downsides where you actually have to wait as far as timing is concerned. If you cast this during your opponent's turn, unless your creature has flash, it doesn't just come back into play immediately. But then there's some weird upsides, and I think it's really neat too that you can potentially reset cast triggers, which isn't something the rest of the spells that do similar stuff as far as exiling a creature and returning it can't really do. And right now we don't have any crazy cast triggers, but could you imagine when the Eldrazi were in Standard or something, if we see something like that, like an Emrakul type trigger that does something crazy when it's cast, it could be even more value from Release to the Wind. So I don't know. There's not really a home for this right now, though, right? We're just kind of waiting to see what comes in the future. Could you imagine playing this with the cards we currently have in our card pool, or is it more a wait-and-see type of thing?
Yeah, I think we have to wait and see, because right now it could be used for something simple like Sorcerer's Spyglass or Gideon's Intervention, so you can reset whatever card you name. But the problem is you just spent 2 cards instead of 1, and so it's card disadvantage if the thing you're using it on doesn't net an effect right away.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Well, let's move on to our second honorable mention, and this is a really crazy one. We have Blood Sun. So I think that people see Blood Sun, and they tend to think Blood Moon. Do you think is this a Blood Moon? Is this a card that can just lock your opponent out of the game, or does this have a more specific purpose?
I really like this card for the fact that one of the reasons I like Blood Moon is it's kind of a prison card, where it turns off some of the abilities or goals, strategies of opposing decks, especially if you built your deck to handle the disadvantage. But with Blood Sun, it's not as extreme as just turning everything red and for preventing people from playing Magic, because the lands you haven't played that make mana are still going to make mana, and you can still play Magic. And that's why I really like this card. Like, I think it's going to impact all 3 formats: Standard, Modern, Legacy.
Yeah, in Standard, I think it's very clearly a good safety valve for things like Search for Azcanta. We got a ton of these flip into Legendary lands that have potential to be powerful, so it's nice to have another answer to that, how big of a deal do you think the can-tripping effect is, Zach? Does this make Blood Sun something easier to put in your main deck because in the worst case it turns into a new card? Like, is that a really big deal or just kind of a fringe benefit?
I want to say it makes the card, because when I initially read this card, I read the draw card bit first, and I'm like, that's kind of weird for red. And then I read the other effect, and I'm like, oh, this is just like Blood Moon. And then thinking about it more, how it would get used, say in Standard a few weeks from now, I decide to play it in my sideboard in my red deck, just as a hedge against any potential land strategies that I don't like. There's no downside on my part to just side it in and cast it, because at the worst, it cantrips. It didn't take up any space. And I think that really makes this card powerful.
Let's move forward and jump into our top 10 list proper. And we're going to start off with the only colorless card on our list, and that is Azur's Gateway that flips around into Sanctum of the Sun, which, when I saw the text on Sanctum of the Sun, I think I literally said, wow, like, it is just such a flashy bit of text. When I first saw it, I thought, oh, this looks like a good commander card. But you see some potential for Standard here as well, Zach?
I think it could be a big player in Standard. I had the same reaction you did when I read the flip side, where you're just getting a whole bunch of mana based on your life total. But I went back and looked at the front, and I thought, how useful is this artifact? Because there's some of the transform artifacts or enchantments where the front side isn't that spectacular, and it doesn't feel like you can do much with it. But what I really liked about the Gateway is it's filtering your draws. It's making your games more consistent. It's making your game plan more consistent because you're able to get the card you want. You don't have to necessarily go all in on trying to get 5 cards exiled. If it happens, it happens. But that whole time you're building up, you're filtering away the extra lands that you draw, and you're getting action spells. I think that's what makes this card important.
Yeah, this might be a bad comparison, but in some ways it's a little reminiscent of Jace Vryn's Prodigy to me, where you get the looting effect on the front half, and then you flip around into something that's potentially really powerful. I also really like that even though Azur's Gateway is legendary, that's not really that much of a downside to play multiples, because you can always just exile away extra copies that you draw, so it's less of a downside than most legendary permanents. Do you think if you're going to look at a style of deck you'd play this in, do you think this is mostly like a control style card where you'd play it and kind of go for the late game and generate a bunch of value? Is that the most common home, you think?
I think so. It definitely feels like it fits in control. I know Jace play the role in control decks back in Standard. This card also feels a good bit like Search for Azcanta, where it's a 2-mana card that helps filter your draws, making your game plan more consistent. I don't know how much the artifact will see play compared to Azcanta, because they're both... Azcanta is very, very good, since you don't have to invest mana into it. And this card, I haven't figured out a good use for the backside yet, because you don't necessarily want to play a Walking Ballista in a control deck. But maybe it's good just to tap a single land to cast, say, 2 Glimmer of Geniuses.
And plus, we still have Paradox Engine in Standard, so maybe we can go super crazy and just try to flip it all in one turn with mega looting, untapping our stuff with the cards we draw.
I always forget about that card. That's a good idea.
Well, next on our list, we're moving to the multicolor cards, and we have another flip card. Journey to Eternity flips around to Etzel, Cave of Eternity. So, what are you planning on doing with this one, Zach?
This, I feel like, has a very good home in any sort of mid-range deck. One where you're kind of just playing value creatures early and you want to survive till the end game. The backside of this, the land that revives creature, is a very strong in-game plan, one that kind of pulls you ahead of whatever the opponent's doing. Similar to how we've seen Scarab God take over games, while this doesn't interact with the opponent's graveyard, it's still very useful. So I think that's where it will see play. One of the reasons I'm excited for it is the front side effect, the aura. While it feels a bit odd to say it's okay to cast an aura, so the creature you enchant doesn't just die immediately, if you're able to put it on a creature and then block with it, like you're promoting this really weird sense of combat where the opponent doesn't want to attack into your creature to have you block, and then it dies, and then you get the creature back and your land transforms. So I think it's going to play a role in a lot of mid-range games because of that.
I know I was definitely excited for this, putting on stuff like Sakura Tribe Elder in Modern, which probably too slow for the format and all that, but it sounds really fun. In Standard, do you think you need to build around this in the sense that you need to be able to have Yahani or something to sacrifice your creature? Is the fact that you can get blown out by, I don't know, a Fatal Push or a Cast Out in response to casting it, is that a really big problem that you got to really work to build around, or just don't worry about it because the payoff is so good when it works out, it's going to be okay anyway?
That's definitely a concern, and I think that's okay. Having a risk where if you play this card and you just throw it out there at the soonest possible moment you can, you might get blown out. If you wait until maybe your opponent's tapped out and they don't have a response, or they played, say, their Glorybringer, they tapped out for Glorybringer and swung, now that gives you an opportunity to play this card and enchant it on something.
Well, let's move on to our next multicolor card, and we have a Planeswalker on the list, Angrath the Flame Chained. I'm really curious what you see in this card, Zach. When I read this over, it felt like a super unique Planeswalker. It doesn't really hit the formula of cards we've seen like Obnixilis, so what can you do with this crazy mashup of abilities?
So when I read this card, it didn't feel that impressive because it costs 5 mana, right? But I immediately compared it to one of the earliest Planeswalkers we had, Liliana Vess, the 5-mana mono black Planeswalker, which has a very similar set of abilities in the sense that the +1 makes the opponent discard a card, and Angrath does the same thing, makes them discard a card and lose life. But the -3 can often be a removal spell, since you can expect most decks to play with creatures that cost 3 or less. That's why I think this one has potential.
Yeah, being able to minus and use it as a removal spell is really good, and obviously if it's just sitting on the board against any deck that's not hardcore aggro, like Ramen on Bread, that's going to have cards in their hand, you'll get a lot of value out of the +1. I also like that you trigger the life loss no matter what, even if your opponent's empty-handed, at least it's doing something with the +1. So I think that's interesting. What do you think about the ultimate? Is the ultimate actually a payoff that you're working towards, or is it just kind of stuck on there and you're mostly going to be plussing and minusing with Angrath?
I think the ultimate is very good. One of the problems with Planeswalkers is that, say you're playing against a Planeswalker and they're ticking it up to the ultimate. The question is, how much do you care that the Planeswalker gets the ultimate? And with this one, I think you do. Because if Angrath has plussed, say, 4 times, you've already lost 8 life, and you've been struggling to keep up because you've been discarding cards, and I'm assuming Angrath will find a home in a control deck. So they've got these removal spells that they're taxing your card resources. And then by the time it ults, if you've already lost 2 life 4 times, so you've lost 8 because you've been discarding cards, and you've already lost some creatures because they've died off, it's probably going to deal 10 or more damage, which might be enough to finish the game. So it is a threat. It is a worthwhile ultimate.
So even though it doesn't necessarily read like I win the game, if you really look at all the abilities on Angrath, it's actually going to be lethal a lot of the time, or very close to it probably.
Right. It's similar to Obnixilis in the sense that it's kind of this inevitable thing that will happen. You just tick it up enough times, and then once the ult happens, it gets very bad.
Let's move on to our white card, and we have a early game removal spell here in Baffling and a little reminiscent of Journey to Nowhere, kind of a more modern version of Journey to Nowhere with some drawbacks. What do you think about this one, Zach?
What I like most about this card, which might seem a little bit surprising, is the fact that it costs 2 mana. For a while, white hasn't really had good 2 mana removal, 1 or 2 mana removal, ever since Declaration in Stone left the format. And so, like, your best bet was getting up to 3 for Thopter Arrest, I think it was called, or 4 for Cast Out. And so you didn't have very good early game removal, and this card costs 2. And it gets rid of an early game creature that you would care about. Maybe the 1-drop that becomes a 3/2 when it attacks with an artifact.
Toolcraft Exemplar.
That one. So this helps get rid of that if that becomes popular again. And the second ability of the card, the fact that you actually don't get your creature back, that's huge, especially if you exile a utility creature.
Yeah, I think giving your opponent a 3/3, even with Trample, that's definitely better than Whirler Virtuoso or a Rogue Refiner or something like that, which would be really devastating when it gets back. So is this a card you think, Zach, that you will play in your main decks, or is it something where you start with it in your sideboard and bring it in against the aggro decks, or do you think it's enough stuff that you'll probably play some in the main deck?
It's very likely this card is worth the main deck slot. One of the other small tidbits about this being a removal spell is the fact that it stays in play. And that's relevant because there are a lot of cards with Ascend that care about how many permanents you have. So enchantment removal is slightly powered up with this set moving into Standard.
Let's move forward to our blue card, and I think this is a card that might be one of the more underrated cards in all of Rivals of Ixalan. I haven't really seen many people talking about Nizala Primal Tide, but I think this card can actually be really good. But I want to hear what you think about it, Zach.
I think they were previewing these once every weekday, a different colored Elder Dinosaur. And when this one came out, I knew that this one would likely see play because it has a lot of text on it. And it looks very similar to some of the other blue finishers that we've seen in the past, notably Pearl Lake Ancient, where it just costs a ton. It has a cool trick to keep it safe, and then it's going to generate some sort of uncounterable value as it sits in play.
So I think my big question with this, and that was the first card I thought of too, Pearl Lake Ancient, you kind of lose the flash, but you gain a ton of other text and arguably a better protection ability. I think discarding 3 cards is less of a drawback than bouncing 3 lands, especially if you want to be recasting your Pearl Lake Ancient. But what do you think with our current Standard format? We've had Approach of the Second Sun kind of be the go-to control finisher for quite a while now. Do you think Nizala is good enough that maybe some decks will go on the Nizala plan rather than Approach of the Second Sun to finish out the game?
I do think so. Maybe not in the main deck because the Elder Dino may not be best against aggro decks, for example. But when you play against another deck that has access to counter magic, so the blue control mirrors, you definitely want something like this. In the last Standard before rotation, people were playing Sphinx of the Final Word as a 7-mana 5/5 can't be countered. This offers the same sort of inevitability of you can't counter this, it will hit play, and it's going to start accumulating value as it sits there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. How good do you think the draw card part of this creature is? Or is that just kind of a bonus that you get for a creature that's already good at closing out games in control mirrors?
I think that sentence is insane. So if you imagine a control mirror where you get up to, say, turn 10, and you're the first person who casts one of these, if your opponent doesn't immediately have an answer to this, how are they going to get one? Are they going to play Draw Go, or are they going to cast Glimmer of Genius or an Anticipate type effect, where each time they do that, you get the draw card?
Yeah, that does seem incredibly powerful, and it kind of even gives you more protection, because then you're going to be drawing into more counter spells, more ways to disrupt the opponent, so maybe we'll end up in a format where the control mirrors are just a race to Nizal, and that's what the format's about in control mirrors.
Right, it's very possible. And even if they do end up finding an answer, you've drawn so many cards at that point, you can just discard 3 and then hide it for a while, and it's safe. So it makes it even harder to get rid of.
Well, let's move forward from our big blue finishers to a red Mythic Phoenix, Rekindling Phoenix. So this card is obviously hard to kill, but what do you plan on doing with it in Standard, Zach?
I really like this card, not as an aggro card, but more as a mid-range or even in a control deck, say with Angrath. Mostly because in order to answer this card, you have to spend multiple. So if you Lightning Strike it, you have to Lightning Strike it again, the egg, before it comes back. I really like the fact that this seems like a playable Phoenix in that regard, that it's just very difficult to get rid of.
Yeah, it does seem very hard to kill, and a 4/3 in the air is still a pretty reasonable clock. I mean, it's not insane, I guess, but it is a fast way to close out the game, especially if you can't kill it. I think this is probably the best Phoenix that they've made, at least in recent years. It might be the best Phoenix they've made ever. So you think this is probably a mid-rangey type card is where you'd probably play it? It won't be competing with Hazaret, for example, and Ramanant Bread?
For the decks that want to go lower, like Ramanant Bread, where everything costs very little, Hazaret makes more sense. For a more mid-range deck, say like Temur Energy, that's already playing Chandra and Glorybringer, imagine playing against this card with Chandra. If they play a 4-mana Phoenix and then you play your 4-mana Chandra, you can't tick down to kill the Phoenix, because then it creates an egg, it revives with haste, and it kills your Chandra. And the same is true with Glorybringer. If you play the Glorybringer and you exert it to kill the Phoenix revives on the next turn and attacks you for 4. But your dragon won't untap, and the Phoenix gets to attack again. So it's a faster clock than either of those.
And it actually curves into Glorybringer well. Maybe we can see some sort of big red type deck with the Rekindling Phoenix and Glorybringer. That sounds like a pretty scary clock in the air.
Yeah, I could see that.
Let's talk about our second red card. We have a pirate, Dyer Fleet Daredevil, sort of this weird reverse Snapcaster Mage type card. So is this something that's for Pirate Tribal, or can it stand on its own with its abilities, Zach?
I don't think it's needed for Pirate Tribal. I expect to see this card immediately in Ramanop red decks, not necessarily in the main deck, but imagine if you sideboard 4 of these and you just bring them in for the second game. That means all of your opponent's shocks and lightning strikes and or braids that they've used to kill your Aethersphere Harvester, you now have access to. And so you get to play a Snapcaster Mage in red, and I mean, it has first strike as well, if that's relevant. But I think this card will make a big impact because of that.
Yeah, I really like that it's a 2-drop that's reasonably on curve on turn 2. I mean, it's not great, but it's fine if you just need to run it out there and you're trying to curve out. But then you still get a lot of utility in the late game. On turn 4, like you said, you have Lightning Strikes and you have Hardness Lightnings you can flash back. On turn 6, you have Glimmer of Genius you can potentially steal. So I think there is a lot of value there. It reminds me a little bit of Abbot of Carol Keep in that regard, as a 2-drop that, yeah, it's fine if you're running down on turn 2, but can be just as good or even better in the late game. So I will be interested. Do you think that the fact that it's a little dependent on the matchup, you can run into matchups that don't have too many spells to flash back, is that what would keep it as a sideboard card, at least right off the bat?
Right. I think this will mostly be a sideboard card, especially if the meta is a little bit unknown with these new cards coming in and you're not sure what decks people are going to play. Because you kind of want to know what you're going to get access to if you play the Pirate. And so for games 2 and game 3, you can know, okay, I can side it in, and I know I'm going to get access to Harness Lightning, or I'm going to get access to Opt and Glimmer.
Yeah, you definitely gain some amount of control, I think, if you see what your opponent's playing first and kind of judge from there. But it definitely seems like a really powerful effect, and I will be interested to see where it shows up. Let's move on to our black cards. Black, I think, is the big winner on our list. We actually have 3 black cards, starting off with another Elder Dinosaur, Tetsamok Primal Death. I feel like this card, Zach, was spoiled so early that people aren't as hyped about it as they should be. Like, we got all these new cards, everyone's focused on spoiler season, and just kind of forgot that Tetsamok is in this set, and it has potential to be really, really good. But what do you think about it?
I think it's going to be a big player, especially in any sort of mid-range deck, one maybe with Journey to Eternity or what have you. This feels like one of the Titans from M11, M12, where it generates so much value when it enters play, and it's nothing that's going to hurt you. It's only going to hurt them by destroying essentially all of their creatures. I had originally thought this dinosaur was you activate it once during your upkeep type effect. And so like when you start your turn, you say, I'm going to put a prey counter on that. And then next turn you put a prey counter on that. But having reread it, it looks like you can, on turn 5, for example, just put 4 of the 5 prey counters on all of your opponent's creatures. And then you just cast it and they all go away. That's an insane blowout.
Yeah, it is super powerful, I think. Just the fact it's kind of like a plague wind or something that comes along with a massive death-touching body, which is pretty good on its own, but I can imagine this card being super, super strong. As you said, the fact that you have so much flexibility over putting counters on things, activating it multiple times a turn if you need to, gives you this mana sink as well, where if you have an unused mana on your turn, and you would normally be letting that mana go to waste, unfortunately, you can do something with it. You can use it to always put a counter on something, and then eventually there's a super big payoff where you're just kind of wrathing away your opponent's board and getting a huge body left behind. So is this another kind of mid-rangey control type card? Is that going to be where it is? Because those are the only decks that can really cast Tetsamok consistently?
It's probably going to be one of those. It's really hard to say because this idea of revealing a card and putting a counter somewhere is kind of new. We haven't really had this type of effect, which means that if you end up drawing this card later in the game, it just gets better. Because if, say, you have 10 lands, you can draw it, spend 4 to do prey, counter somewhere, and then you can play it. And it's just going to get you a lot of value.
Let's talk about our next black card, and we have our one and only Ascend card on the list, Vaana's Hunger, so an edict that becomes a super edict if you manage to get Ascend. What do you think about this one, Zach?
I think this card is good because without Ascend, it looks very similar to other 3-mana black cards that make an opponent sack a creature, such as To the Slaughter, Oath of Liliana, Foul Tongue Invocation, Tribute to Hunger. We've had a lot of them over the years. But the coolest part about this card, compared to all of those, is if you're playing it in a control deck, you're likely going to end up with Ascend at some point. And then all of a sudden, it's going to get you extra value every time your opponent has 3 or more creatures in play.
Yeah.
I think that's what makes this one really big.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, because 3-mana instant speed is pretty much the going rate for an edict effect these days for the last few years. So you're already getting kind of the normal rate for the front half of the card, which means Ascend is just a bonus. Like, if you want to edict, this is fine anyway, and then maybe sooner or later it's more than an edict, and that's awesome. And then I could imagine some matchups where it's great, where you're actually killing 2 or even 3 creatures, and it's a really big deal. So it feels like a very playable card. Also nice that it gets around indestructibility on stuff like Hazoret, if you're killing off all the 1-drops and 2-drops and 3-drops, and then that Hazoret comes down and is just giving you nightmares. Vaana's Hunger is a way to answer some of those really hard to deal with creatures that we have in our current standard as well.
Right. It's curious that it's half, because that means since they get to choose, they're always going to get to pick which of the best ones they're going to keep around. But even then, it's eating away at so many of their resources. And it's also fixing a problem that some control decks had with a card like Roller Virtuoso that generated a lot more creatures for a single body. This can help clean that up.
Also, I just realized it actually is rounded up as well. So if there's 3 creatures, you're actually going to get 2 of them, right? If I'm understanding that?
Right. So the only time you don't want to cast this is when they have 2, because then they pick their best creature. If they have 1, you get their best creature. And if they have 3, it's always a 2-for-1.
That seems like a pretty good deal. That's a lot of situations where this is good once you have Ascend turned on. Well, let's talk about the last card on our list. And this one has been getting a bit of press lately because Patrick Sullivan over on the SCG event this weekend went on a epic rant about Ravenous Chupacabra. So, Zach, how good is this creature?
It's hard to say how good it's supposed to be. It feels like it's really good because it's going to do something immediately when it hits play, and it just sits there. And it's good with a lot of other cards that we've seen, such as Scarab God, where you've now got Doomblade type effect on a creature. I'd say the only place this isn't good is against control, but that may or may not be true if we expect the blue Elder Dinosaur to see play, because then it's not a creature spell, it's not a non-creature spell, so they don't get to draw a card, but you still get to target their creature in an attempt to kill it. It feels really weird because we had other 4-drops like Hostage Taker or, say, Gonti that has Death Touch that essentially plays the same role of being a nuisance. And this one just kind of does it unconditionally.
So is this a main deck card? Like you're building, I don't know, some sort of mid-rangey deck that has black in it. Will you be considering Chupacabra as a main deck removal spell?
I don't know how I would end up playing with this card. I think it'll start as seeing play as a main deck card. It doesn't feel like the 2/2 body would be worth a 4-mana removal spell. Maybe that's a little bit too slow or clunky. But the fact that it can get rid of anything aside from a Hazoret or a Scarab God makes me think that it will end up seeing play, because you can kill off Glory Bringers or the Winding Constrictor.
Yeah, I love Panharmonicon decks, and one of the things I've learned playing Panharmonicon decks is the 4-drop slot is just crowded. You mentioned Gonti, there's also Hostage Taker, there's so many somewhat similar cards in that slot that you just can't really run all of them without really throwing your curve out of whack. So it'll be interesting to see if Chupacabra can actually unseat cards like Gonti or Hostage Taker. Do you think it's just worse than those cards, or does the fact that it's unconditional, is that enough of an upside to make you want to play this over a Hostage Taker or a Gonti?
I think it fits a good mix. The fact that you could play all of them, for example. Gonti would be more helpful against control than Hostage Taker or the Chupacabra. And Hostage Taker would be better against deck that has a lot of 1-drops and 2-drops, because then you're not spending 4 mana to kill a Soulscar Mage. you're spending 5 mana to steal the Soulscar Mage, for example.
That's a good point. I think it'll be interesting. What about God Pharaoh's Gift? Do you think this could show up in God Pharaoh's Gift decks as a good target for getting back, or not especially?
I think that's probably the best place to put this, actually, because it helps slow down the game to a point where once you resolve that God's Pharaoh Gift, then you're going to start getting a whole lot more advantage because your creatures do important things. Now you summon the Chupacabra a second time, and it's a 4/4 that also destroys a creature. That's got to put you ahead.
Yeah, that seems pretty good to God Pharaoh's Gift it back. That's a lot of value to be had, and it's kind of unique in that way. We saw Hostage Taker doing it, and that does a nice imitation, but can run into trouble if your opponent has removal or something. So I think it'll be exciting. We haven't hit a Necrotal in Standard for a long time, and this is arguably just a better Necrotal since you don't have the restrictions on black creatures and artifact creatures and whatnot. So anyway, I think that brings us to the end of our top 10 Rivals of Ixalan cards for Standard. So any final thoughts on anything on the way out the door, Zach? Rivals or these cards or whatever? I'm
really excited to see where these cards can take Standard. I think the thing I'm most excited about is being able to play with some more dinosaurs. Ixalan promised dinosaurs, but it didn't seem like they really took a hold of Standard at all. I never really saw any cool decks playing with dinosaurs that ended up doing well. And I think they have a good chance here, partly because of the Elder Dinosaurs, and partly because there's a few more that have really cool Enrage effects.
Yeah, we definitely got some cool Enrage stuff. So out of the tribes, Dinosaurs, do you think that's the tribe that is closest to breaking out in Rivals of Ixalan Standard?
As a tribal deck, it's hard to say. I think it's more likely vampires would do it, or merfolk, but I think Dinosaur as a creature type will definitely see play.
Oh, that's exciting, because I know one of my biggest disappointments with Ixalan was we got all these cool tribes. Everyone was hyped for dinosaurs and pirates and merfolk and vampires, and it just never really panned out. Like you said, dinosaurs just never really were good enough. We saw Hostage Taker pop up here and there, so we saw a couple of cards from the Ixalan tribe show up, but hopefully with another set of support, we'll really see a lot of these creature types in Standard, and we'll actually feel like we're playing Ixalan Standard and not just, Kaladesh Standard with a couple of Ixalan cards thrown in. Anyway, Zach, thank you so much for hanging out. It was a blast to do this. Definitely appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about some Standard cards.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you had me on. I love talking about new cards and their potential, especially the ones that feel a little bit underwhelming.
Yeah, well, I think we came up with a pretty good list. So thanks again for doing it, and thanks to everyone for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know in the comments what cards from Rivals of Ixalan are you most excited for? What's on your top 10 list? What do you agree with or disagree with? What can't you wait to play with? Let us know. Again, thanks for watching, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.